that's how you do it. Damn. All right. So, okay, so this is Rick's White Boy Rick. He's White Boy Rick. This is his first time doing, first of all, doing Twitter and even knowing about Twitter Space. But I wanted Rick to come on and because we're going to be talking about drugs. You know, me and the judge got into an argument the other day. He was yelling at me. We was talking about the crack era, but it's a lot of things that overall that we're going to talk about because the first initial title was what was it, crack, was crack a white supremacy strategy that basically destroyed the Black community? Mute up, Rick. Press the mute button. Yeah. So so when you're going to speak, Rick, just press the mute button. And Judge, I don't know what's going on with your thing either because it was a slight feedback.
Yeah,
Do you have
well,
an
I had to
earpiece?
get rid of my earphones that I had because they ran dead. I got to charge them back up.
Okay, but can you take your leather coat off because that cringing noise is like killing my ears.
You can hear that?
Yes, honey, that's some good cow skin.
It's not cow.
What is it?
Horse hide.
Well, whatever. It's good. That's some high quality mess because I can hear it, but it makes me feel like you're scratching a chalkboard.
Except it's laying on the floor, not on me. Oh, anyway.
Well, it sounds like something crunchy. I don't know. But anyway, all right. I don't know where we're going to start at, but I'm going to kind of start somewhat in the middle. And I'm going to take it to why me and you started off with an argument, right? Because I said that crack destroyed the Black community. And in which crack came into play in the mid 80s, 82, 83. You said that it was cocaine and it started, I believe, 60s, 70s. And so I'm bringing White Boy Rick in because I do want him to introduce himself briefly because of his background. He went undercover, with narcotics and a lot of other stuff. So he has a lot of firsthand experience and knowledge, the same as you, Judge. And of course, this conversation is going to be expanded, and probably, develop into other topics of discussion. So, Judge, White Boy Rick, how about you introduce yourself to the audience so people know who you are and a little bit about your background?
All right, I came into law enforcement in 1992 as a deep undercover operative. I was friends and family thought I went bad. Badge and gun were locked away in a safe, and I was wanted all over the state of California and beyond for multiple things, primarily surrounding the drug subculture, dealing, transportation, and then various crimes related to that as well, robberies, some assaults, and other crimes. As far as that, in law enforcement, 15 years. After some injuries, then got pieced back together, started independent contract and investigation companies. Did those for a better part of 9 years before I retired again. And now I'm actually a pastor in the state of Arizona.
You're not the real White Boy Rick who was a drug dealer and FBI informant, but you are a white man with a lot of narcotics background. So I coined that term for you, White Boy Rick. All right, so the question that I originally had for the title, and I'm going to say yes, it says, was crack a white supremacy strategy on the Black community? I say yes. So I don't know if you want to go, Rick, or Judge, but you're the guest, Rick. So was crack a strategy for the Black community to destroy the Black community?
I'm going to remove the white supremacist strategy because I don't agree with that platform, but I do believe it was a strategy to destroy the, I believe that they're not, or them allowing these things to occur and allowing these things to further. There's a lot of things occurred, and of course, Judge is very familiar with the Nicaragua Contra affair. He understands the funding, how drug money was used to fund this much better than I am, I'm sure. There was a lot of things going on that could have been stopped and could have been at least curtailed to a certain degree that allowed it to take hold in the inner city communities. And government agencies were able to use this to gain additional funding, to gain power. And I think through their not allowing prosecution or not aiding in prosecution in some of the subjects, they knew exactly what would occur. So I think by them standing by and allowing this to occur, and then also benefiting from some of the funding and the organizations that they ended up developing attachments to, that certainly we knew what was going to happen. It's as if I think I was talking to you last night, you're drinking at a party, and though you don't intend to hurt anybody when you go driving, you've had a few drinks, you're just buzzed, you get in the car, you get down the road, and you get in an accident. Well, even though you didn't have your primary intention wasn't to hurt or injure anybody or get involved in an accident, you knew that your actions could potentially lead to somebody's injury or death, and therefore you're guilty of crimes related to that. Whether your intentions weren't, you could have easily stopped yourself. So, and Judge can explain that a lot better, but the idea is if you could have known, you should have known. And I've worked with other undercover operatives in various agencies of different levels in the government, and many who were involved in during this time. And their comment is, we knew dang well what was happening, and the upper echelon told us to stand down. And I've been involved in other situations where we recognized that there was going to be a potential fallout for certain things, and instead of allowing a more positive level of involvement or an information, we were told to stand down. Sometimes that can be to great benefit. We will allow certain things to occur so we can see who's involved in the organization, and we let it go on for a certain period of time until we get the web as wide as possible so we can bring everybody in. In this situation, in a lot of the documentation that was, made public, of course, books written by people, and we can take that for either here, one way or the other, with people that were directly involved in it, admittedly directly involved in it, even in the different trials that went around. It seems to hold true that the government could have known, should have known, and did know some of the problems. Now, did they invent cocaine? Not at all. Did they invent crack? No. We know that the Colombians began bringing it in through the Caribbean in the 80s, even potentially 1980, maybe a little bit earlier. They found a good way to bring it in. They found it was a way to make this new potent form even cheaper, highly addictive, and it opened up the doors. They just kind of greased the skids, so to speak. And I think that's blatantly obvious. And again, if we just use a method of investigation, there is deduction and, of course, inductive investigation, and this is inductive reasoning. We know that certain things occurred. We know that we had the ability to stop it. We knew we had the intel, and a lot of it's been made public by now. We certainly had the intel about who was doing what, and the government actually intervened with various levels of law enforcement, telling them to stand down, that they were on the case instead of allowing these things to go forward.
Okay.
Was there a lot of screw-ups? Yes. Do I believe it was a direct attack against blacks specifically? Yes and no. Meaning, I'm a firm believer the government is no friend of the American people. And I'm a firm believer that there are forces within our government, not the entire government, not everybody in it, that seeks to divide and conquer. And I think we can read, there's documentation after documentation about how different ethnicities, the black population, have been targeted by many different aspects of our government, and also those people in the lower socioeconomic scale, how they've been abused by our government by misinformation.
Okay.
So I think we can infer that, it definitely was detrimental to the especially the Afro-American population. And we also talked about the genetic component to addiction and how addictive certain things are, and it's something else we can get into.
Yeah, we're going to get into that. Let me just write that down so I won't forget genetic component. Because just hold that right there. I want to go to the judge. Diop, I see your
All right.
request. You're going to be the first person I go to when I bring people up. But go ahead, Judge.
Let me give you a little history lesson on this. Cocaine is not new. It was done heavily in the Americas as something to energize people, to give them extra energy. They didn't have horses, so they had to do long distance communications on foot. So it gave long distance runners who had communiques the energy they needed. Now, where does Coke come from? The exact same place that you get chocolate from. So every time you eat a Hershey bar, a Nestle's Crunch, you get a piece of chocolate candy, chocolate cake, chocolate ice cream. You are getting a product that also has a component that produces coke. The coke comes from the leaves. Now, granted, most of the time they use trash plants to make the cocaine, but you can get excellent high quality cocaine from the plants that make the best chocolate. And if you go to Switzerland and you get their chocolate, it's not the equivalent of decaffeinated. It's got cocaine in it. And the chocolate that the Royal Navy serves instead of coffee has a cocaine component. So it's an old thing. King George V, King Edward, Sherlock Holmes, uh, Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, they all dabbled in cocaine when they were bored. That whole thing about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll became Mr. Hyde when he got too heavy into the coke. That was the magic elixir that he was drinking that turned him into a monster. Now, in the 1960s, coke got popular amongst the affluent black, white, brown, red, yellow. For the most part, it was tremendously expensive and there was a lot of money to be made from it. And it was not looked at as something that was addictive, at least not physically. Freebase started getting a hold in the early mid 70s, and that was you cooked the cocaine and you got freebase, which is essentially what crack is. Now, there's a weird thing about coke. If you put thousands of dollars worth of coke on a coffee table at a 1960s party, if 100 people hit it, all but five would say, "Oh, yeah, okay, interesting, but okay, you can get Benzedrine, will give you a more intense high, the same kind. It only costs a nickel, $5. They give you two in your rations in Vietnam, so people would accumulate 700 of them by the time they came back after they hit five to see what it was about and sell them for $5 a hit. And students would use the stuff to study for finals. And most of the people didn't like the nasal congestion that came from using the coke. But out of every 500, out of every 100 people who used the stuff, there would be five that got something psychological out of it that nobody else got. And they became coke freaks. Now, if you took five of that group out of every 100 and you put 100 of them together and you gave them freebase or later crack, you would get 98, 99 sprung junkies because it was doing something to them it would not do to others. Now, when you got Superfly came out in 1971, what happened is it glorified the stuff and a lot of people wanted to get into it. But Coke was still a very expensive thing. This arms for the Contras and supplying arms to the so-called freedom fighters that got Osama bin Laden in the middle as the middleman. He exchanged the cash for the Stinger missiles and other stuff. And the Reagan administration got caught up in this plausible deniability routine garbage, turned bin Laden into an enemy, and then we got what we got out of that. And then there were the three executive orders that Ronald Reagan signed, ordering his folk to disregard the congressional rules, the laws that had been passed, forbidding this trade in arms to help out the Contras, and things got real nasty. crack got brought into the community somewhere early 80s, but it didn't make any economic sense because you were selling crack more cheaply than you were the product that it was made from. The equivalent would be taking 55 gallons of 93 octane gas and selling it for cheaper than you would a 55-gallon drum of unrefined crude oil. It didn't make economic sense. But what happened with crack is it changed it from a drug that only the affluent could afford, that made a lot of money in the buy, sell, and trade aspect of the drug, into something that was very cheap. And you also have to combine it with Joe Biden and Eastland and Stennis and Byrd coming up with legislation that, as Biden used to brag about, one rock will get you 5 years in a federal penitentiary. And that was combined with the uh, ending of federal parole, so that if you got a 5-year sentence, you'd serve 58 of the 60 months in federal custody, even though the last 2 months might be in a halfway house. So it started impacting the black community, but I don't think it was set up as any kind of white supremacy thing. I think J. Edgar Hoover, who it seems actually was a black man and whose parents got run out of Louisiana for trying to pass by the Klan, he had an abject hatred of things that reminded him of his origins. You can see that in others, including Justice Clarence Thomas from time to time, or all of the people that want to check other on the race ethnicity boxes when it comes to filling out forms. But crack became a strange thing because I know I used to talk to, represent, and lecture to DEA agents from the late 80s on up through the early 90s. And I challenged them to find crack manufacturing centers. And some of them were surprised when they didn't get much success. Now, I know Wesley Snipes, who is a personal friend of mine, played in New Jack City where that was going on, but the reality was not what it seems. Now, freebase has become crack. It's widespread, but it's not really the problematic drug right now. That has become fentanyl, which is a lot cheaper, a lot more addictive, and a lot more harmful than anything that they've got out there, other than perhaps heroin, but it even makes that pale into
Well,
insignificance. So we have a thing that has torn down the black community and a lot of other communities. And in some of the other impacted communities over the last 30 years, those have been crack has been replaced by opiates and crystal meth, and now things like amphetamines that used to supplement it have fallen by the wayside. Benzodrine has fallen by the wayside because there's no longer a ready supply thanks to the U.S. Army and Marine Corps. So we have this fentanyl that has become a convenient, dangerous drug of choice that is extremely inexpensive in massive quantities are being smuggled across the southern border. I will also add this too: the shipments of drugs that have come in, the cocaine from South America and Mexico, have been accompanied by cases of military grade rifles and weaponry. And the far left has seized upon that to start talking about the trade in machine guns and assault rifles and gun shows and gun stores, which simply does not occur. But the drug thing and the weapons thing have been inextricably combined. Coke
I
comes
don't
in,
want to go too far.
weapons come in, coke comes in, and what the driving engine has become is a furtherance of this thing that led to arms for Contras, drugs for arms for Contras, drugs sold in the black community with a concept you hardly hear anything about now, which is called the sacrificial lamb. In other words, in order to get something important, sacrifices had to be made, and the sacrifices became the poor communities and the minority communities for the so-called bigger picture. Now,
Mhm.
initially, it started off to fund black ops and such things in terms of anti-communism, and it has morphed into a way to finance black ops when they deal with so-called terrorism. And you find that enormous quantities of drugs and weapons are coming in from South America, usually cocaine, in weapons that are of American nature. You find that when you get the Kalashnikov variety, along with opiates, they come in from Israel, who has tremendous stocks of seized Kalashnikov weaponry from the Arab Israeli wars going back the last 70 years. And they bring in the opiates, and that's supposed to finance anti terrorism. You get Kalashnikov stuff and opiates coming in from Iraq and also from Afghanistan. And from Korea, you get more opiates that come in with American hardware since they're replacing it with their own indigenous
Which is
Daewoo.
why our American government was over in Afghanistan, over in Iraq, because what, they wanted to cease the opium plants there as well.
Well, no, here's the thing with the opium plants. Tea. The United States, to an extent, exists because the U.S. at the time and England had a fixation on tea. One of the last effective Chinese emperors decreed back in the 18th century, toward the end, that tea could not be purchased except with gold. The English treasury under King George III went broke, and to an extent, the American colonies got free because the English government couldn't afford to prosecute its efforts to retain them any longer. So, what wound up happening is enterprising Yankee traders decided to get in on this gold mine, so to speak, of selling tea. So, the tea came from China, but they needed gold. So, what they did, along with the English, was to cultivate the growing of opium poppies in what was known as northern Nigeria. That's now known as not Nigeria, northern India. That's now known as Afghanistan. So, for 200 plus years, the United States and Great Britain and then France propped up one drug lord after another to get the opium so they could sell the opium for gold in China and then hand the gold right back to get tea. So it was a triangular trade. So when you see a bottle of Cutty Sark Scotch with a clipper ship on it, or you hear about the famous Flying Cloud clipper ship, that was part of this triangular trade that the English and the Americans engaged in, of opium for tea, excuse me, opium for gold, gold for tea. Now, how far into the present did it extend? Well, the Americans had a treaty agreement with Chiang Kai shek that stipulated that if America helped Chiang Kai shek's nationalist Chinese regain power from the Mao communists, then Chiang Kai shek's China would permit the United States to continue the opium for tea trade, also the English and the French.
All right,
There,
bring it
hold on
forward to
one more
today.
second. One more second. The Kung Fu societies in China, known as the Boxers, started the so-called Boxer Rebellion back in 1904. This went through 1906, where the U.S. sent in the Navy and the Marines to compel the Chinese to continue allow the development and expansion of opium dens to addict Chinese so that we could sell them opium in exchange for tea. So you've got this trade that's still going on right now, which is why Afghanistan is so unstable, because it's got a 200-year history of the American government, the French government, the English government, and every now and then Japan, Italy, and Germany jumping into the mix, destabilizing the place after you prop up one drug lord after
Is
another.
it okay? Let me ask you this:
So that's
is
why
it
we
is
have
it
this mess.
trade? Is it trade because of the fact is that if you have all of these different nations got their hands in Afghanistan, Afghanistan's probably don't have no choice but to give it up.
No,
So
they have a choice, but the problem is they've become so warlike with 200 years of continuous, let's say, organized crime activity that they don't know how to have stability. And the Taliban started off as a coalition to try and give some stability to the region. Now, right now, it's still unstable because of that. And the U.S. government turned a blind eye in order to bring domestic peace into Afghanistan by allowing the opiate trade to build back up. So you have to consider cocaine and the opiate trade as generating money for what some people think is a bigger, higher thing to be interested in. Now, I don't know if that's white supremacy trying to just oppress black folk so much as black folk and other minorities and the downtrodden make a good market for this garbage.
all right, so with all that history, right? Because I don't want this whole conversation to be about the
No,
history,
but I
but it's
mean the
good to
background
have the
important.
the back with all that background history of it. Do you would you say that crack specifically, right, was a strategy, a white supremacy strategy or not, but was a strategy to destroy the black community?
No, I wouldn't. It was a happenstance. The black community was a convenience. It was
Okay,
not
and
intended
that's what I disagree
for.
with you
Well, I know,
with.
but see, back in the 70s, when our boy, Sir Rick was still in public school, I was
That's a
defending
stab at
people.
you trying to throw shade at Rick.
No, I'm not. But I'm just saying,
Oh.
when you were just born, I was handling gangsters and thugs who were deep off in this trade back in the 70s.
But
So
even in
all
the
I'm
70s,
saying,
Judge, they
and then
still
when I'm
dumped
in
it
the
in black communities.
no, hold on. In the 60s, I recall going to those Hollywood parties and everything where we militants got invited to add flavor and seeing $5,000 of cocaine on a coffee table when an executive at a major studio didn't get paid $35,000-$40,000 a year. All right. So I can remember those days and I saw it develop and I saw Superfly and the glorification. When the black community got turned on to Coke, ordinarily it was only the ball players, the singers, the musicians, and stuff like that that got a chance to deal with it. Now,
All right.
I saw the development.
I want
So
to
I'm
go
not
to
getting on anybody. I'm just talking about I was there and saw it.